Well, it's good to be back. If you were following along with the misadventures of Tom and Colita on Facebook, you know that we had a few challenges. It's not often that you have a car break down while you're in transit on a 1,000-mile round trip, but when you're driving two cars and they both break down, that causes some adventures. But we are here, and we're still blessed by our trip and by our time down at Johnson University for their homecoming conference. Very much a gathering of Christians and of believers sharing together in the love of God, and we always appreciate that. We appreciate a little bit more of the warmth that we can experience down there in the month of February as well. We are backing up a couple weeks. A couple weeks ago, when I was last here, we had such a wonderful service with Alyssa and with the other things that went on during the service that I had no time to preach. So I pushed this back to today. We're talking about measuring by God's standard. And we're looking at the life of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah was considered one of the greatest kings of all of Israel. He was king of Judah, but he seemed to come in second, only to be superseded by King David. And this is the final in our series on Stand in the Gap. We've been looking at the good kings of Judah. Now, let me remind you, there were 30 kings in the southern nation of Judah. And of those 30 kings, only 8 were considered good. But of those 8, there were only 5 that were mostly good. And that's what we've been looking at here through the winter, the 5 good kings of Judah. We're winding up with Hezekiah, who was considered the greatest of those good kings. But he still had his faults. Now, anyone who can see out our windows to the east, and I can see the brick wall of the building, but if you can see the skyline of Sault Ste. Marie, you may be blocked by our canopy, but I'd like you to tell me what tall structures you see out to our east. It may take a little bending down to look. Don't be afraid to go to the window. I'm going to wait until I hear the answer. What do you see out to the east that stands above other buildings? Tower of History, St. Mary's Cathedral, the courthouse clock. That's the answer I was looking for. The courthouse clock. Back in the days before everyone had the exact time on their cell phones. And by the way, I never thought I would do this, but I'm not wearing a wristwatch anymore because I have a smartphone that sometimes is too smart for its own britches. But I do have a smartphone, and the time is accurate. The time is always there, unless I forget and let the battery run down. I started with wristwatches. I started with ones that you would wind by hand. And then I had what was fabulous in its day, a self-winding watch. It would wind itself anytime you moved your arm. You could hear it, and you never had to wind it. And then I went to battery-powered watches. And finally, when I got this little booger, the watch kind of disappeared, and I rely on this. But back before we all had the exact time on our cell phones, and back before we relied on our computers, and even back before this country was divided into 4 standard time zones, communities relied on accurately running public clocks. Here in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, the one clock that governed the correct time for this town and for the whole county of Chippewa is still running in that clock tower. The tower of the Chippewa County Clock House has had a clock keeping time for this community since 1877. That's what the town relied on. That was county time, whatever that clock tower said. Now, there's a story about a man who walked by a jewelry store every day on his way to work. He would stop and he would set his pocket watch by the big clock that was in the jewelry store window. One day, the jeweler happened to be standing in his doorway, and he greeted this man in a friendly way. He said, "I see you set your watch by my clock. What kind of work do you do that demands such correct time each day?" And the man answered, "Well, I'm the watchman at the plant down the street. My job is to blow the 5 o'clock whistle." And the jeweler was startled. He said, but you can't do that." "Well, why not?" asked the man. He said, because I set that clock by your whistle. Do we get off track sometimes? One relying on the other and not being sure which one is really accurate? Without a correct standard of measure, we can all get off track. And when those mistakes are recognized, we need to take measures to correct them. How many recognize these two little tools that are probably in everyone's house? This is a yardstick, and this is standard measurements, 36 inches. When I was in high school, my mom had her favorite yardstick out on the dining room table. I borrowed it for something, and then I slapped it around a little bit, just kind of for the beat, and about 3.5 inches broke off. And I looked at it, and I thought, how am I going to tell Mom that I just broke her favorite yardstick? She was out at a ladies' Bible study that evening. So I looked at the piece that broke off, and I slipped it in, and it looked perfect. So I just laid it there on the dining room table. When Mom came home from her Bible study, she sat down at the dining room table, had a cup of coffee, and I came over and I leaned up on the table and I was thumbing on the yardstick. And I said, Mom, guess what? And she said, there's 36 inches in a yard. And I said, nope. And I popped off the end, there's 32 and a half. She did the same thing. She laughed. So we use a standard of measure. We also measure things that are level by using a level. Now, it's interesting, on some measurements, I have a 24-inch measure on this level, but on the bottom, we have the metric numbers. Have you ever made the mistake of wanting to measure something in inches and you found out you measured it in centimeters instead? It happens. What do you have to do? You have to make a correction. And corrections are important for us to make. There are corrections that need to be made in our lives. And those corrections are things that God would have us do. And this is what we see happening within the kingdom of Judah, the nation of Judah, as they were rounding up with the last of their kings, and only a few good kings left. Of all the good kings of Judah, Hezekiah was considered the greatest. Only David, who was God's standard of measuring all good leaders, was greater than Hezekiah. And God still calls for his people to stand in the gap. But for that kind of revival, that kind of commitment to happen, we need to do more than just simply turn to God. We need to turn from sin. And that's tougher. It's easy on a Sunday morning to sing songs of worship and praise, even to raise our hands in adoration to God. But during the workaday week, during the times of stress, during the difficult times that we might have in family life, we find ourselves struggling, and we find ourselves sometimes not turning from sin. We see Hezekiah was honored because he was a man who, much like David, was after God's own heart, and he turned from sin. In 2 Kings chapter 18, we see that Hezekiah was willing to reject what tears down. We need to do the same. We need to reject in our lives and in our church and in our homes things that tear us down. 2 Kings chapter 18, I want to read verses 1 through 4. There's a number of passages here in two different Old Testament books about Hezekiah, so I'll be mentioning some and I'll be reading some specific verses. But let's take a look specifically at 2 Kings 18, the first 4 verses. In the 3rd year of Hosea, son of Elon, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father or his ancestor David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. Now, we need to understand a little bit more about what was going on. There are times we must remove what is wrong in our lives. Hezekiah removed the high places, the Asherah poles, the places of high worship. These poles or sometimes stylized carved trees, stood as sacred monuments and tributes to the Canaanite goddess Asherah. The Canaanites often worshipped her in the woods and with the trees, and made some special trees for real worship to her because of her association with the tree of life. Now, the other thing that we see that's interesting is that Hezekiah destroyed Moses' bronze serpent. Where have we heard that before? A couple places. You remember the story of Moses creating a bronze serpent during the Exodus? That story is found in Numbers chapter 21. The Israelites had disobeyed God, and they were being attacked by snakes. And so Moses told them, look upon this bronze serpent lifted up on a pole, and you'll be healed. And the people did. Well, because of that miracle, that bronze serpent was saved all these hundreds of years later. And because Moses said, healing comes when you look upon this bronze serpent, not to God, but to a bronze serpent, people started worshiping the emblem and not worshiping God. And so it became a false god to the Israelites. But you know, there's another place in the scriptures where the bronze serpent is mentioned, and it's mentioned by someone no less than Jesus Christ. We all know John 3:16, don't we? For God, let's say it together. For God so loved the world, what? That he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. How many know verse 17? God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save it. But do you know the verses that are before it? Prior to John 3:16, when Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, he said this, just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent before the people, and all men were saved, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And then Jesus said, God loved the world so much that he gave me to you. Just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent in the wilderness, so that people who would gaze upon it would be saved, so God is lifting me up. God is saving the world through me. That's a powerful emblem to be referred to by Jesus out of all those Bible stories. And yet this bronze serpent became an idol to the people of Judah in Hezekiah's day. They were worshiping the idol. They were not worshiping the God who saved. Jesus' point here was, he is the one to be looked upon. Not pagan poles, not idols, not relics. We do not worship the past, our past victories. We don't worship a particular denomination or a particular church heritage. We don't even worship the Bible. There was a time in a sermon that I tore a Bible up in front of the congregation. And one of the teenage girls leaned over to her mother and says, "You can go to hell for that, can't you?" I'll never preach a sermon like that again because it tore me up to do it. But the point was, there are parts of the Bible that people don't accept. So let's pull out the creation account. There's parts of the Bible that people don't accept. So let's pull out the story of the virgin birth of Jesus. There's parts of the Bible that people don't accept. So let's pull out any references to resurrection. And all I had by the end of that sermon was an empty cover. And scattered on the floor around me were pages of the scriptures. But some people, if they worship the Bible instead of the one of the Bible, think that that's a horrendous thing to do. Now, it tore me up to do it. And yet, I made my point. I also didn't last there long. Here's the point. We don't worship relics. We have communion every Lord's Day, but it's not the emblems that are holy. It's the emblems that represent the one who is holy. We have a Bible, and we take care of our Bibles. I have a situation, every month it seems, someone comes to me and says, "I have an old Bible, what should I do with it?" And they usually wind up giving it to me. So I take it down to Salvation Army, and it goes in their free Bible bin. But we don't want to destroy things like this. We think that this is holy. Don't worship the serpent, worship the Christ. And make him the Holy One. That's what Jesus wants us to do. We need to worship not the pages of paper, but we need to worship the one the pages of paper tell us about. And so it's so important that we reject what tears us down and can take us away from our focus on the lordship of Jesus Christ, because we focus on things. Secondly, we need to affirm what builds up. We need to tear down what destroys, but we need to affirm what builds up. When we have removed what is wrong, when we have cleaned house, we need to add what is right. If you have a clean house but no one lives there, what good is it? You need to add what is right. And Hezekiah opened the doors of God's house and he repaired them. We're told that in 2 Chronicles, the other book we're looking at, chapter 29, verse 3. Hezekiah opened the doors of God's house, of the temple, and he repaired them. They'd been neglected. It seems like that happens every time a good king came along. He found out that there was neglect in the house of worship. There was neglect in the sacrifices. There was neglect in the hearts of the people. And in verses 4, 5, and 16 of 2 Chronicles 29, we are told that as a nation, there was a return to holy living. Because Hezekiah said, God's house needs to be honored. Now, this building is not holy. You know what is the house of God? You know what is holy? You know what is the temple of God today? It's you and me. The Spirit lives in us. We could be meeting out under the trees. I wouldn't recommend it in February, but we could be meeting out under the trees. We could be meeting in a rented hall. What makes any place we worship in holy is the fact that God's Spirit is in the believers who meet. And that's what's so important. We affirm what builds up. And what we see here was this return to holy living. Now, for many years, the Eastern Upper Peninsula, in fact, much of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, was known for their dairy farms. And before the days of processed milk, when it was poured into bottles, the cream always rose to the top. So, if you had whole milk, before there was homogenization in one of these old bottles, and you left it sit, you would see a line of separation. And the top portion would be pure cream. The bottom portion would be skim milk. If you wanted a good glass of whole milk, you would have to make sure the lid's on nice and tight, and you would shake it. And mix the cream back into the milk, and then pour yourself a glass, and you would have a glass of whole milk. If you wanted just the skim milk, you would dip out the cream from the top, put it to the side, and then, of course, what can you do with the cream? You could do whipped cream. You can use it in your coffees. You can put it on strawberries. I heard that. You can whip it into butter. But it takes a lot to do that. Well, you know, the milk producers realized that there was a formula. In whole milk, there was always a certain percentage that would be cream. It would always gather to the top. And in these old bottles, it was hard to get down in there and get the cream. So they came up with a cream top bottle. This bottle specifically is divided. It's indented here. It's tucked. And then there's a blob on the top. When they pour the whole milk into this bottle, the cream would settle out. But they knew the exact percentage, and these bottles were created with that exact percentage in mind so that the cream was only in the top part. Now, they had something else that was ingenious. I think I have one of these tucked away somewhere in my garage in a box of stuff that, honestly, in 10 years, we probably have never unpacked. But they had cream top spoons, which would dip down in here. It had a hook, and it would dip down in here, and the spoon would not go any lower than the indentation, and you could scoop the cream out really easily. You could scrape off the sides and put it off to the side. You'd still have your milk, but you'd have your cream, and it was an easy way to remove the cream to save it for whatever purpose you were going to use it for. But homogenization came along. And with homogenization, we see that the dairy industry found that there was a way to chemically alter the cream separation so that the particles stayed mixed. So when you go to the grocery store today, you can buy all sorts of milk, can't you? You can buy whole milk, which has all the milk fat. You can buy 2% milk, which has 2%, 1%, which has 1%, and skim milk, which has 0.5%. And it never separates because it's been homogenized. And when we see that, we are seeing molecules that literally attach the cream to the milk and the milk to the cream, so they no longer separate. There's a problem with homogenization when it comes to worship. And there was a problem in Hezekiah's day. Some people didn't want to see the differences. They wanted to see a blending of everything. And the problem that was happening then is that they were compromising their beliefs. They were homogenizing things, mixing them up. So it was okay to worship Jesus. Well, in their day, it was okay to worship God, but it was okay to worship Baal. It was okay to worship Asherah. You believe what you want to believe, I'll believe what we want to believe, and we'll all get along. And Hezekiah said, no, we need to come to God. We need to come to God. The cream no longer rose to the top. The cream became diluted by the world and mixed in, and nothing distinct was there. So Hezekiah restored true worship in verses 20 and 21. And then in chapter 30, verse 1, he took a public stand for God. He invited all the people of Israel, both Judah and Israel, to come together and worship. In chapter 30, we see that some mocked him. But in verse 11, some humbled themselves and came. And then we have in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verses 18 through 20, these words. Let me turn to it here. It says, a very large crowd of people assembled in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the second month. That's Passover. Passover still was celebrated in New Testament times. It's still celebrated by today's Jews. Bread, by the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the second month. I started at verse 13 instead of verse 18. Let me continue to read. They removed the altars in Jerusalem and cleared away the incense altars and threw them into the Kidron Valley. They slaughtered the Passover lamb on the 14th day of the second month. The priests and the Levites were ashamed and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the temple of the Lord. And when they took up their regular positions, as prescribed in the law of Moses, the man of God, the priests sprinkled the blood handed to them from the Levites, and since many in the crowd had not consecrated themselves, the Levites had to kill the Passover lambs for all those who were not ceremonially clean and could not consecrate their lambs before God. Now get this. Although most of the many people who came from Ephraim, Manasseh, Issachar, and Zebulun had not purified themselves. This is the northern tribes. This is the group that had gone into pagan worship so much sooner than the southern tribes had. They had not consecrated themselves and purified themselves for worship, yet they ate the Passover, contrary to what was written. But Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, "May the Lord, who is good, pardon everyone who sets his heart on seeking God. The Lord, the God of his fathers, even if he is not clean according to the rules of the sanctuary." And the Lord heard Hezekiah, and he healed the people. Do you realize that the genesis or the source of that beloved old invitation hymn, "Just as I Am," really comes from this passage? They came as they were. They hadn't cleansed themselves. They didn't know that they were supposed to. They were defiled. And Hezekiah said, "Oh God, but they know you. They want to know you. Please take them as they are." And he did. He did. You see, that's what's so important. God looked at the heart, and he saw the reality of restoring true worship. Have you gone to the county fair and you've seen the strongman's test? You know, that long pole that goes up, and they give you a sledgehammer and they tell you to strike the base of that pole, and there's a disc that can go up somewhere along the measurement of the pole. It might say that you're a weakling, or if it rings the bell, you're a strong man. Have you ever swung that hammer, that mallet, and been embarrassed? I have. It takes a little more than what you think it should. It supposedly determines whether you're a weakling or you're the strong man. God doesn't demand that you ding the bell at the top. He only asks you to pick up the hammer. And by the way, if you're too weak to pick up the hammer, He will help you pick it up. And He will help you swing. And He is the one who is strong. And all glory goes to Him. We need to affirm what builds up. Thirdly, there are some results of true revival. The people not only heard the leader, but they were changed. Chapter 31, again, 2 Chronicles 31, verse 1. When all this had ended, the Israelites who were there went out to the towns of Judah, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. They destroyed the high places and the altars throughout Judah and Benjamin and in Ephraim and Manasseh. And after they had destroyed all of them, the Israelites returned to their hometowns and to their own property. There was real revival. They rebelled against the enemy. Returning to God, returning to God means that we rebel against the one who is the enemy of God. And true revival does not take us out of a battle. Guess what? True revival sometimes puts us smack dab in the center of the battle. There are things that need to be done for God. There are things that need to be done for the sake of the church. There are things that need to be done for our brothers and our sisters in Christ. And we need to understand that sometimes the one God calls on to do it is you and me. Revival is like a remodeling job that so many of us have experienced. It takes longer than we thought it would take. It costs more than we planned to spend. It made a bigger mess than we thought it would. But when we do it right, it's worth every effort. We look at the result. We must fight the enemy. And to do that, we have the benefits of revival. Here's the key benefit. In chapter 32, verse 22, God was with them. And He will be with us as we get rid of the things that we don't need to be involved in, and as we turn to the things of God, the results of true revival, God will be with us. He'll be with us. His promise is still true. But finally, in the fourth place, we see that Hezekiah dealt with an illness. And then Hezekiah recovered from that illness. Back in 2 Kings in chapter 20, we are told about Hezekiah really being on a deathbed situation. But really what the writers are telling us, as you read the story of what happened and then what happened afterwards, is that we have to be careful about what we ask for. God granted Hezekiah 15 more years of health, 15 more years of life. And people look at that and they say, isn't that wonderful that Hezekiah prayed for his health was returned. But if you look at the story of what happened in those 15 years, you might wonder if he would have been better off dying at the height of his glory. 3 bad things came during those 15 extra years of Hezekiah's life. He was showed Judah's treasures to Babylon. He had a son, Manasseh, who became Judah's wickedest king. And he became lifted up with arrogance and pride. Yes, this greatest king of Judah, this one who seemed to be the greatest king next to David, found himself failing in those 15 years of extra life that were granted to him. You know, we need to understand that God's wisdom is always, always greater than our wisdom. And if we want God to change our lives, we must abide by His standards, by His measure. We cannot compromise and mix our faith, but we need to know what is pure. And we need to value that and use it for all it's worth. We need to make a stand for Christ. We need to stand for His church. We need to understand that if we don't abide by His standards, there is no other means of measurement. Listen to Ezekiel 22. We started there weeks ago when we talked about standing in the gap. I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it. But get this. God said, but I found no one. I found no one. There's one thing we need to do today. And it comes with 2 prongs of attack. Actually 3. We need to reject the wrong. We need to turn to what is right. And we need to seek God. When God looks to the church today, when he looks to us, whether we are here in Sault Ste. Marie or he sees the church around the world, will he find someone who can stand in the gap? When in Nigeria right now, churches are being burned to the ground with worshipers inside them, are people standing in the gap? When we see evil taking place around us, are people standing in the gap? May we hear the words of God to Ezekiel. I looked for someone among them who would build that wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land. And may we instead hear God say, and I found them. I found them in the people who worship my Son, in the church. It's not just up to preachers and elders and deacons to stand in gaps. Every believer needs to stand for what we know is right and true, and we need to be faithful. We need to reject the wrong. We need to turn what is right. We need to seek God, and we need to stand in the gap. When the time of measuring comes, will we be found faithful? God asks us to do his work, to be his people, to speak his words, to be a representative in a difficult time, and to make sure that there's no apologies and there's no compromise for what we know the Scriptures tell us to do, and we commit ourselves to it. Would you stand in the gap? Even the best of Judah's priests, the best of Judah's kings, Hezekiah, had his faults. Would you turn your faults over to God and stand in the gap? Let's stand together and make this a time of commitment, a time of decision. If you need to make a public decision for Christ, we invite you to come forward as we sing this song together.